The morning watch aboard the USS Essex had just begun when aviation ordnance man first-class Tommy McKenna noticed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was February 17th, 1944, and the pre-dawn darkness over the Central Pacific concealed what would become the largest concentration of naval striking power in human history. Task Force 58, under Admiral Raymond Spruance and Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell, was bearing down on Truk Lagoon with 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, and more than 900 combat aircraft. But what McKenna saw in that moment was not the awesome display of American industrial might spread across the horizon. What he saw was the face of Seaman Second-Ass Jerry Nakamura, a Japanese-American sailor from Hawaii. As Jerry translated the intercepted radio transmissions crackling through the Combat Information Center, the boy was crying. "They don't know." "We're coming," Jerry whispered, his voice breaking as he passed the casual chatter between Japanese air control towers across the Caroline Islands. "They're talking about mail delivery schedules and movie nights. They have no idea." McKenna would later remember this moment as the instant he understood the true magnitude of what was about to unfold. Not just another raid, not just another island, conquest in the bloody march across the Pacific, but the moment when American naval aviation would demonstrate a capability so overwhelming that it would render obsolete every assumption about naval warfare that had governed the previous 3 centuries. The Essex-class carriers of Task Force 58 were about to prove that the age of the battleship was over and that a new form of warfare, one measured not in the range of great guns, but in the endless cycling of aircraft from flight decks that never slept, would determine the fate of empires. 6 months earlier, the Central Pacific had belonged to Japan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's carefully constructed defensive perimeter stretched from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the Solomon Islands in the south, anchored by the seemingly impregnable fortress of Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands. The combined fleet used True as its forward operating base, a massive complex of anchorages, airfields, and supply depots that American intelligence officers had dubbed the Gibraltar of the Pacific. From Truk, Japanese naval and air forces could strike at any Allied advance across the Central Pacific, protecting the vital sea lanes that connected the resource-rich southern areas to the Japanese home islands. The Japanese strategy was elegant in its simplicity. The outer ring of fortified atolls, including the Gilbert Islands, Marshall Islands, and Caroline Islands, would serve as unsinkable aircraft carriers, their coral runways and hidden gun positions, making any American advance prohibitively costly. Japanese planners calculated that even if the Americans could muster the naval strength to assault these positions, the casualties would be so severe that American public opinion would force a negotiated peace. They had seen what happened at Tarawa, where 1,009 Marines died and 2,001 were wounded in just 3 days of fighting to capture a coral atoll, no larger than the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Says if that was the price for a single atoll, what would be the cost of advancing through hundreds of similar fortifications all the way to Japan? But the Japanese had miscalculated on a scale that would prove catastrophic. They had failed to grasp the true implications of American industrial capacity, and they had not anticipated the revolutionary changes in naval aviation that were even then taking shape in the shipyards of Newport News, Brooklyn, and Norfolk. The Essex-class aircraft carriers that began entering service in late 1943 represented more than just larger flight decks and more aircraft. They represented a fundamental transformation in the nature of naval power itself. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, the air group commander aboard the USS Essex, understood this transformation better than most. As he stood on the flight deck in the pre-dawn hours of February 17th, watching the final preparations for the strike against Truk, he could feel the rhythmic vibration of the ship's machinery beneath his feet. 4 massive steam turbines generated 120,000 horsepower, driving the Essex and her sisters at speeds exceeding 30 knots. But speed was only part of the equation. What made the Essex-class truly revolutionary was its ability to sustain high-tempo flight operations around the clock. The Japanese think of aircraft carriers the way they think of battleships. McSell had explained to his squadron commanders during the final briefing They see them as platforms for delivering a single decisive blow. But that's not what we are. We're factories. We manufacture destruction on an industrial scale, and we never stop. The numbers told the story. Each class carrier could launch and recover aircraft continuously with deck cycles that operated around the clock. The ship's 2 elevators could move aircraft from the hangar deck to the flight deck in 90 seconds. The 2 steam catapults could launch a fully loaded Grumman F-6F Hellcat or Douglas SBD Dauntless every 30 seconds. Most critically, the Essex-class had been designed to operate not as individual ships, but as part of integrated task groups, with 3 or 4 carriers supporting each other in circular formations, protected by fast battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. This was the concept that Admiral Mark Mitre had perfected during the Marshall Islands campaign in January 1944. Task Force 58 had demonstrated at Kwajalein and Majuro that American carriers could maintain continuous air operations for weeks at a time, launching strike after strike while simultaneously providing air defense for the fleet and close air support for amphibious operations. The Japanese had never seen anything like it, because nothing like it had ever existed. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the hero of Pearl Harbor, who now commanded the Central Pacific Area Fleet from his headquarters on Saipan, had watched the destruction of the Marshall Islands with growing alarm. The speed of the American advance was unprecedented. Kwajalein Atoll, which the Japanese had fortified for 2 years and defended with 8,500 troops, had fallen in just 4 days. The American 4th Marine Division and 7th Infantry Division had used lessons learned from the bloody assault on Tarawa to perfect their amphibious tactics. But what truly shocked Nagumo was the role of American naval aviation. The Essex-class carriers had maintained continuous air cover throughout the Marshall Islands operation, launching more than 2,000 sorties in support of the landings. American F-6F Hellcats had swept Japanese aircraft from the skies over Roy Namur and Kwajalein, while SBD Dauntless dive bombers and TBF Avenger torpedo bombers had systematically destroyed every Japanese installation on the captured atolls. But the most disturbing aspect of the American performance was the sustainability of their operations. Japanese carrier doctrine called for massing all available aircraft for a single decisive strike. But the Americans had demonstrated the ability to launch continuous attacks for days on end. They operate their carriers like we operate our airfields, reported Commander Runosuke Kusaka, Nagumo's chief of staff in a classified assessment sent to Combined Fleet Headquarters in February 1944. But their airfields can move at 30 knots, and they are defended by battleships. We have no answer for this. Kusaka's report would prove prophetic. As Task Force 58 approached Truk Lagoon in the early morning hours of February 17th, the Japanese combined fleet was about to discover that their most powerful fortress had become a trap. The first indication that something was wrong came at 05:30 hours when radar operators at Truk's Eaton Airfield detected a large formation of aircraft approaching from the east. Lieutenant Jiro Tanaka, the duty officer at the Truk Air Control Center, initially dismissed the contacts as a navigation error. American aircraft carriers were known to be operating in the Marshall Islands more than 700 kilometers away. No carrier-based aircraft had the range to strike Truk from that distance and return safely to their ships. But at 06:15 hours, as the sun rose over, the Caroline Islands, 72 Grumman F-6F Hellcats from Task Force 58 swept over Truk's northern airfields at treetop level. The fighters belonged to air group Alps from the USS Enterprise, USS Yorktown, USS Essex, USS Intrepid, and USS Bunker Hill, supported by the light carriers USS Belleau Wood, USS Cat, USS Terry, and USS Cowpens. This was the largest carrier strike force ever assembled, and it had approached True undetected by maintaining strict radio silence and operating beyond the range of Japanese reconnaissance aircraft. The Japanese response was immediate, but confused. Approximately 80 Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters scrambled from True's 3 operational airfields, but they faced several critical disadvantages. First, the American Hellcats held both altitude and speed advantages over the lighter Japanese fighters. Second, The Japanese pilots were largely inexperienced replacements, hastily trained to replace the veteran aviators lost in the prolonged fighting over Rabaul and Bougainville. Most critically, the Americans had achieved complete tactical surprise. Henson Roy Rausch, flying a Hellcat from the USS Lexington, would later describe the air battle over Truk as the most one-sided fight I ever saw. The American fighters had climbed to 25,000 FT during their approach, giving them the energy advantage of altitude when they dove on the rising Japanese formations. The F-6F Hellcat, with its 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine, could dive faster than the Zero while maintaining better control at high speeds. More importantly, the Hellcat's heavy armor and self-sealing fuel tanks allowed it to absorb damage that would have destroyed a Japanese fighter. Within 2 hours, 50 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed in aerial combat, with the Americans losing only 4 Hellcats. But the air battle was merely the opening act. Even as the fighter sweep cleared troop skies of defending aircraft, a second wave of American planes was approaching the lagoon. These were the strike aircraft SBD Dauntless Dive Bombers, TBF Avenger, torpedo bombers and F-4U Corsair fighter bombers from the 9 carriers of Task Force 58. Their Achi targets were the ships anchored in Truk Lagoon. What they found exceeded even the most optimistic American intelligence estimates. The lagoon contained the remnants of the Japanese combined fleet battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and more than 30 auxiliary vessels, including tankers, transports, and repair ships. Admiral Minichi Koga, Yamamoto's successor as commander of the combined fleet, had ordered most of the heavy units to withdraw to Palau when American reconnaissance flights were detected on February 4th. But the logistical vessels remained. There, holds packed with fuel, ammunition, and supplies intended to support Japanese operations throughout the Central Pacific. Lieutenant Frank Lawler, piloting an SBD Dauntless from the USS Enterprise, selected the largest target he could find, the submarine tender Rio de Janeiro Maru, a converted passenger liner that had been serving as a floating repair facility for Japanese submarines. The 461 FT vessel was anchored in the center of the lagoon, surrounded by smaller craft unloading supplies. Lawless 1,000 lb bomb struck the ship amid ships, penetrating several decks before exploding in the engine room. The Rio de Janeiro Maru settled by the stern and sank within minutes, taking with her the accumulated spare parts and technical equipment that Japanese submarine operations in the Central Pacific required. Similar scenes played out across the lagoon as American dive bombers and torpedo planes systematically destroyed the logistical infrastructure that had sustained Japanese naval operations for 2 years. The light cruiser Kati, attempting to escape through the North Pass, was caught by torpedo bombers from the USS Intrepid and sunk with all hands. The destroyers Maikaz and Noke, their crews, frantically attempting to raise steam, were overwhelmed by coordinated attacks from multiple squadrons. By noon on February 17th, more than 20 Japanese vessels had been sunk or damaged beyond repair. But the true measure of American naval aviation's transformation was not the destruction achieved on the first day, but the fact that it continued without interruption for a second day and then a third. The Essex-class carriers maintained continuous flight operations throughout the attack on Truk, launching strike after strike while simultaneously recovering damaged aircraft and rearming those that returned. This was the deck cycle that never slept, a feat of coordination and endurance that Japanese naval aviation could not match. Aviation Chief Petty Officer Hiroshi Suzuki, serving aboard the light carrier Chitose at Truk, observed the American attacks from a position that gave him a unique perspective. On both sides of the battle, Suzuki had been a naval aviator for 15 years, participating in the Pearl Harbor attack and the early victories in the Dutch East Indies. He understood aircraft carrier operations better than most, and what he witnessed at TR convinced him that Japan had lost the war. Our doctrine calls for massing all available aircraft for a single attack, Suzuki wrote in his diary on the evening of February 17th. We launch everything at once, achieve surprise, deliver maximum damage, and withdraw. But the Americans do not withdraw. They stay and they attack again and again and again. Their carriers operate like air bases, but air bases that can move and are protected by the most powerful fleet ever assembled. Suzuki's observations were confirmed by the tactical analysis conducted by the surviving Japanese staff. Officers at the American carriers had maintained continuous air operations for 48 hours, launching more than 200 combat sorties against targets throughout the Caroline Islands. The logistical implications were staggering. Each Essex-class carrier embarked approximately 90 aircraft, requiring hundreds of tons of aviation gasoline, thousands of rounds of ammunition, and hundreds of bombs and torpedoes. The ability to sustain such intensive operations while remaining at sea represented a revolution in naval logistics that the Japanese could not replicate. The secret lay not just in the size of the Essex-class carriers, but in their design philosophy. Unlike Japanese carriers, which prioritized aircraft capacity over survivability, the Essex-class had been built to operate under combat conditions. For extended periods, the ship's ammunition handling systems could move bombs and torpedoes from the magazines to the flight deck in minutes. The aviation gasoline storage and distribution systems could refuel an entire air group without interrupting flight operations. Most importantly, the carrier's damage control systems and armor protection allowed them to absorb battle damage and continue fighting. This last capability would be demonstrated repeatedly throughout 1944 and 1945. The USS Franklin survived 2 major kamikaze attacks, including one that penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar bay, killing more than 700 men. The USS Bunker Hill endured similar damage and continued operating. Not a single Essex-class carrier was sunk during the war, despite sustained attacks by Japanese aircraft, submarines, and suicide bombers. The implications of this survivability extended far beyond individual ships, because Essex-class carriers could absorb damage and continue fighting. American task force commanders could accept risks that would have been suicidal for more fragile vessels. This aggressive doctrine, pioneered by Admiral Mark Mitcher, allowed Task Force 58 to operate deep within the Japanese defensive perimeter, striking targets that had previously been considered unreachable. The destruction of Truk Lagoon demonstrated this new reality with devastating clarity. On February 18th, the second day of Operation Hailstone, American carrier aircraft destroyed an additional 27 Japanese vessels and finished off targets that had been damaged on the previous day. The total destruction included 12 warships, 32 merchant vessels, and 275 aircraft. More than 140,000 tons of Japanese shipping lay on the bottom of the lagoon, along with the fuel, ammunition, and supplies that had been intended to sustain Japanese operations throughout the Central Pacific. But the strategic impact of the drunk raid extended far beyond the immediate destruction. The Japanese combined fleet, deprived of its forward operating base, was forced to withdraw to bases in the Western Pacific beyond the range of American land-based aircraft, but also beyond effective striking distance of American advances in the Key, Marshall, and Gilbert Islands. This geographic displacement would prove decisive in the battles to come, as Japanese naval forces found themselves unable to effectively support ground defenders in the Mariana Islands and beyond. The American success. A troop also validated the strategic concept underlying the Central Pacific campaign, rather than advancing through the heavily fortified Japanese positions in a series of costly frontal assaults. Admiral Chester Nimitz's forces could use their superior mobility and striking power to neutralize key enemy positions and then bypass them entirely. This island-hopping strategy reduced American casualties while accelerating the pace of advance toward Japan. The foundation for this strategy had been laid in the Gilbert Islands 3 months earlier, where American forces had first demonstrated the integration of carrier aviation amphibious assault and advanced base construction that would characterize the Central Pacific campaign. The assault on Tarawa Atoll in November 1943 had been a costly education in the realities of amphibious warfare against prepared positions. The 2nd Marine Division had suffered more than 3,000 casualties in capturing Betio Island Correlat, barely 300 acres in size. But the lessons learned at Tarawa would transform American amphibious doctrine and make possible the rapid advances that followed. Chief among these lessons was the critical importance of advanced base construction. Within hours of securing Betio Island, Navy Construction Battalion 74, the CBS had begun the transformation of the captured Japanese airfield into an American airbase. Working under constant threat of air attack and hampered by the coral and debris that littered the island, the CBS had the airfield operational within 15 hours of the end of organized resistance. This achievement, repeated throughout the Central Pacific campaign, would prove as important as any victory won by Marine infantry or Navy pilots' dark construction. A battalion chief, William Big Bill Morrison, had been a civilian contractor in Hawaii before the war, building runways and hangars for the growing network of Army and Navy air bases that protected the approaches to Pearl Harbor. When the Japanese attacked on December 7, 1941, Morrison had watched from the roof of his headquarters building as Nakajima B-5N torpedo bombers swept over Ford Island and devastated the Pacific Fleet, the site of American battleships capsizing in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor had convinced Morrison that the age of the battleship was ending, but it had taken 2 years of war for him to understand what would replace it. The answer became clear during the assault on Kwajalein Atoll in February 1944. Morrison's battalion, the 121st Naval Construction Battalion, had landed with the 4th Marine Division on Roy Island on February 1st. The pre-invasion bombardment had been more effective than anything previously attempted. With Task Force 58s, carriers and the fast battleships of the Pacific Fleet delivering concentrated fire for 3 days before the Marines went ashore. When the first wave of amphibious tractors crossed the lagoon reef, they found the Japanese defenses largely destroyed and the defenders demoralized by the continuous bombing and shelling. We went from ship to shore to operational airfield in 60 hours. Morrison would later report to his superiors. That included removing the debris from the Japanese installations, grading and surfacing a 4,300 FT runway, installing fuel systems, and constructing operational facilities for a full fighter squadron. The Japanese had spent 2 years building Roy into a fortress. We turned it into an American airbase in less than 3 days. The speed of American base construction had strategic implications that extended far beyond the tactical advantages of forward airfields. Each captured atoll became a stepping stone for the next advance. But more importantly, it became a node in an expanding network of American air power that could support operations throughout the Central Pacific. B-24 Liberator heavy bombers based at Tarawa could strike targets in the Marshall Islands. B-25 Mitchell medium bombers based at Kwajalein could support operations in the Caroline Islands. The American advance was creating its own infrastructure of support while simultaneously destroying the Japanese equivalent. The Japanese response to this transformation was hampered by fundamental limitations in their industrial capacity and strategic doctrine. Japan had begun the war with a technological edge in naval aviation, exemplified by the superior performance of the Zero fighter and the skill of Japanese naval aviators. But Japanese industry could not replace losses at the rate they were being inflicted, and the Japanese training system could not produce new pilots quickly enough to maintain quality as quantity demands increased. Commander Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, and now served as a staff officer, with the combined fleet, recognized the magnitude of the crisis facing Japanese naval aviation. In a confidential report submitted to Admiral Koga in March 1944, Genda outlined the fundamental disparities that were developing between American and Japanese carrier operations. The enemy has achieved industrial and operational capabilities that we cannot match, Genda wrote. Their Essex-class carriers are larger, faster, and more survivable than our ships. Their pilots receive more training and fly more advanced aircraft. Most critically, their logistical systems allow them to sustain high-tempo operations indefinitely. While our forces are limited by fuel and ammunition constraints that grow more severe with each passing month, Genda's analysis was painfully accurate. Japanese aircraft carriers, designed for speed and aircraft capacity, lacked the armor protection and damage control systems that allowed American carriers to operate in contested waters. Japanese pilots, while individually skillful, received less training time than their American counterparts due to fuel shortages and the pressure to replace combat losses quickly. Most importantly, the Japanese logistics system was breaking down. Under the pressure of American submarine attacks and the increasing distances over which supplies had to be transported. The submarine war in the Central Pacific was being fought in parallel with the surface actions, and it was proving equally decisive at American submarines operating from advanced bases in the Marshall Islands and supported by intelligence from the ultra-codering program was systematically destroying the merchant shipping that connected Japan's far-flung empire. The statistics were devastating. In 1943, American submarines sank 335 Japanese merchant vessels. In 1944, this number increased to 603 ships sunk, representing more than 3 million tons of shipping. The USS Seahorse, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Sladecar, exemplified the aggressive submarine warfare that was strangling Japanese logistics. Operating from Pearl Harbor and later from the newly captured base at Majuro Atoll, the Seahorse conducted 6 war patrols between January 1943 and September 1944, sinking 20 Japanese vessels totaling more than 72,000 tons. But Cutter's most significant achievement was not the tonnage he destroyed, but the strategic impact of his operations in the approaches to Truk Lagoon. During the submarine's 4th patrol in March 1944, the Seahorse intercepted a Japanese convoy carrying aviation gasoline and aircraft parts to the beleaguered garrison at Truk. The convoy consisted of 3 cargo ships and 2 escort destroyers, representing a substantial portion of the logistical support available to Japanese forces in the Caroline Islands. Cutter's attack, conducted on the night of March 15th, sank all 3 cargo ships and damaged one of the escorts. VT loss of this convoy forced Japanese commanders at Truk to further reduce air operations, conserving fuel and ammunition for what they assumed would be an eventual American invasion. The invasion never came. American strategic planners, following the doctrine of bypassing heavily defended positions, had decided that TR could be neutralized without the need for a costly amphibious assault. The massive carrier raids of February and April 1944 had destroyed Japanese air power in the Caroline Islands, while submarine attacks had severed the supply lines that might have allowed a recovery. By mid-1944, Truk had been transformed from Japan's most formidable forward base into a strategic liability, its 40,000-man garrison isolated and ineffective. This transformation reflected the broader changes in Pacific naval warfare that the Essex-class carriers had made possible. Traditional naval strategy based on controlling key geographic positions with fortified bases and powerful fleet units was being superseded by a new form of warfare based on mobility, sustainability, and the projection of air power. The Americans had not simply built better ships, they had created an entirely new way of fighting at sea. The technical innovations that enabled this transformation extended throughout American naval aviation. The integration of radar and radio communication allowed American task force commanders to coordinate the operations of hundreds of aircraft across thousands of square miles of ocean. The development of underway replenishment techniques allowed American carriers to remain at sea for weeks at a time, refueling and rearming from fleet oilers and ammunition ships without returning to port. The establishment of advanced bases throughout the Central Pacific provided staging areas for long-range operations and havens for damaged ships and aircraft. But perhaps the most important innovation was organizational. The alternating command structure that Admiral Ernest King had established for the Pacific Fleet allowed American forces to maintain continuous operations while giving commanders time to plan future operations. When Admiral Raymond Spruant commanded the Fifth Fleet, his carriers were designated Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark Mitcher. When Admiral William Bull Halsey commanded the Third Fleet, the same carriers became Task Force 38 under Admiral John McCain. This rotation allowed one command team to conduct active operations while the other planned the next offensive, creating an operational tempo that the Japanese could not match. The Japanese were acutely aware of their disadvantage, but lacked the industrial capacity to remedy it. Captain Atsushi Oi, a staff officer with the combined fleet who had observed American operations from the beginning of the war, submitted a detailed analysis to the Naval General Staff in April 1944 that outlined the hopelessness of Japan's position in the Central Pacific, that the enemy has demonstrated the ability to project air power on a scale that renders our fixed defenses obsolete. OI wrote, Their carrier task forces can deliver more aircraft to any target in the Central Pacific than we can base permanently at that location. Worse, their mobile bases can be reinforced and supplied indefinitely, while our fixed installations become isolated and untenable once the enemy achieves local air superiority. WWII's report recommended a fundamental change in Japanese strategy, withdrawing the combined fleet to the waters near Japan, where it could be supported by land-based aircraft, and concentrating defensive efforts on the Marana Islands, which were close enough to Japan to receive meaningful support. This recommendation would be partially adopted, but it came too late to alter the outcome of the Central Pacific campaign. The assault on the Marana Highlands in June 1944 would demonstrate the full maturation of American amphibious and carrier warfare doctrine. Task Force 58 now expanded to 15 fleet carriers, and 4 light carriers would support the simultaneous invasion of Saipan Guamantinian while simultaneously defeating the Japanese mobile fleet in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Great Marianas. Turkey shoot as American pilots dubbed the aerial battles of June 19 to 20, 1944, would destroy the last effective remnant of Japanese carrier aviation. But the foundations for that victory were laid in the seemingly routine operations of the Essex-class carriers during the long months of 1943 and 1944, when American flight decks maintained their relentless cycle of V-launch and recovery day and night in all weather under all conditions. It was this capability, the ability to sustain high-tempo operations indefinitely, that gave American naval aviation its decisive advantage over its Japanese opponents. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most successful fighter pilots, experienced this transformation firsthand during the fighting over the Marshall Islands. Sakai had scored more than 60 victories during the early phase of the war, including several American aircraft shot down during the Pearl Harbor attack. But his encounter with American F-6F Hellcats over Kwajalein in February 1944 convinced him that the tide of war had turned irrevocably. The Americans had learned how to fight, Sakai wrote in his memoir. Their aircraft were better than ours, their pilots were better trained, and there were many more of them. But what truly frightened me was their organization. Japanese fighters would attack individually, each pilot seeking personal glory. American fighters attacked as a team with coordinated tactics and mutual support. They fought like a machine, and we could not defeat a machine with individual courage. Sakai's observation captured a fundamental aspect of the American transformation in naval aviation. The technical superiority of American aircraft and the industrial capacity that produced them in vast numbers were important, but equally critical was the development of tactical doctrine that maximized the effectiveness of these advantages. American carrier air group ops trained extensively in coordinated attack techniques using radio communication and standardized procedures to deliver concentrated firepower against selected targets. This tactical evolution was exemplified by the air group aboard the USS Essex, commanded by Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell. McCampbell, who would become the Navy's leading ace with 34 confirmed victories, had developed a training program that emphasized teamwork over individual skill. His pilots practiced coordinated attacks against simulated targets, learning to divide responsibilities and provide mutual support during combat. The results were demonstrated repeatedly during the Central Pacific Campaign, as Essex Air Group consistently achieved superior results against Japanese opposition. "We don't train heroes," McKell explained to a war correspondent during the Marianas campaign. "We train professionals. A hero might shoot down 2 or 3 enemy aircraft before he gets killed. A professional will shoot down 1 enemy aircraft and come back to do it again tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that." This professional approach to naval aviation was reflected in every aspect of American carrier operations. Maintenance procedures were standardized across all ships, allowing air group ops to transfer between carriers without losing efficiency. Logistical systems were designed for sustainability rather than maximum capacity, ensuring that operations could be maintained even under adverse conditions. Most importantly, American commanders planned operations with the expectation that they would continue for weeks or months rather than hours or days. The contrast with Japanese carrier doctrine was stark. Japanese naval aviation had been built around the concept of the decisive battle in which all available forces would be concentrated for a single overwhelming attack that would determine the outcome of the campaign. This doctrine had worked effectively during the early phase of the war, when Japanese forces enjoyed technological and tactical superiority. But as American capabilities increased and Japanese resources dwindled, the limitations of this approach became apparent. The Japanese carrier force that faced Task Force 58 in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 exemplified these limitations. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet included 9 aircraft carriers embarking approximately 430 aircraft, a substantial force by any previous standard. But Ozawa's pilots were largely inexperienced, having received minimal training due to fuel shortages and the urgent need to replace combat losses. The carriers themselves were operating with reduced ammunition loads and limited fuel capacity, reflecting the breakdown of Japanese logistics in the Central Pacific. When Ozawa launched his attack against Task Force 58 on June 19, 1944, the result was a catastrophe that Japanese naval aviation would never recover from. American F-6F Hellcats, guided by radar and coordinated by experienced fighter directors, intercepted the Japanese formations before they could reach the American carriers. In a series of aerial battles that lasted throughout the day, American pilots shot down more than 300 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 30 of their own. The lopsided nature of the defeat earned the engagement its nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the aerial victories, devastating as they were, represented only one aspect of American superiority in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Task Force 58 demonstrated its sustainability by continuing operations after repelling the Japanese attack, launching its own strikes against Ozawa's retreating fleet. American dive bombers and torpedo planes sank the carriers Hio and Shukaku and damaged several other vessels, while submarines operating in coordination with the carrier task force sank the carrier Taihaho and the destroyer Shigur. The coordination between surface and submarine forces highlighted another innovation in American naval warfare. The Essex-class carriers and their supporting vessels maintained continuous communication with American submarines operating in the area, sharing intelligence about enemy movements and coordinating attacks to maximize damage. This level of inter-service cooperation was unprecedented in naval warfare and reflected the comprehensive approach to military innovation that characterized American strategy in the Pacific. The submarine USS Albacore, commanded by Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard, demonstrated this coordination during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Operating in the waters east of the Mariana Islands, the Albacore had received intelligence from Task Force 58 about the approach of Ozawa's mobile fleet. When the Japanese carriers appeared within torpedo range, Blanchard was ready. His attack on the carrier Taihaho, Japan's newest and largest aircraft carrier, resulted in the ship's destruction and the loss of more than 1,600 Japanese sailors and aviators. The carrier boys told us where to look, and we did the rest. Blanchard reported to Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Pacific Fleet submarines. It was like hunting with a guide who could see the whole forest from the air. We couldn't miss this. Integration of air and submarine operations represented a revolution in naval warfare that the Japanese could not replicate. Japanese submarines designed primarily for attacks on enemy warships lacked the capability to sustain prolonged operations in enemy-controlled waters. Japanese naval aviation focused on the decisive battle concept could not provide the continuous reconnaissance and communications support that effective submarine operations required. The cumulative effect of these American advantages became apparent during the final phase of the Central Pacific Campaign, when Task Force 58 turned its attention to the Japanese home islands themselves. The capture of bases in the Mariana Islands had brought American B-29 Superfortress bombers within range of Japan. But it also allowed the Essex-class carriers to operate in waters that had been considered the inner sanctum of Japanese defense. The raids on Tokyo and other Japanese cities in February and March 1945 demonstrated the complete transformation of naval warfare that had occurred during the Central Pacific Campaign. American aircraft carriers operating within 200 millimeters of the Japanese coast launched strikes against targets that included aircraft factories, naval bases, and transportation infrastructure. The attacks continued for days at a time, with the carriers maintaining their operational tempo despite attempts by Japanese land-based aircraft and kamikaze units to drive them away. Commander Mitsuo Fuida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and now served as an operations officer with the combined fleet, witnessed the American operations off Okinawa from his position at the Naval General Staff in Tokyo. In his final report on American carrier capabilities submitted just weeks before Japan's surrender, Fuida acknowledged the complete transformation that had occurred in naval warfare. The enemy has created a form of sea power that we cannot counter with our remaining forces. Fuida wrote, "Their carriers operate continuously, their aircraft attack relentlessly, and their fleet can absorb damage that would destroy any similar Japanese formation. We began this war believing that spirit and skill could overcome material disadvantage. We have learned that industrial capacity and organizational efficiency are more decisive than courage or tactical brilliance." Fuida's assessment was confirmed by the final statistics of the Pacific War. American submarines had sunk 1,314 Japanese naval vessels and 358 merchant ships, totaling more than 5.3 million tons of shipping. American carrier aircraft had destroyed thousands of Japanese aircraft and hundreds of ships while supporting amphibious operations that captured every major Japanese position in the Central Pacific. The Essex-class carriers had steamed more than 300,000 m in combat operations, launched more than 100,000 combat sorties, and lost not a single ship to enemy action. The human cost of this transformation was enormous on both sides. More than 36,000 American sailors, Marines, and soldiers died during the Central Pacific campaign, while Japanese losses exceeded 300,000 military personnel and civilians. The industrial destruction visited upon Japan by American bombing campaigns, supported by bases captured during the island hopping, advanced devastated Japanese cities and forced the emperor's decision to surrender. But beyond the immediate consequences of victory and defeat, the Central Pacific campaign had demonstrated the emergence of a new form of warfare that would dominate military thinking for the remainder of the 20th century. The integration of air power, mobility, and advanced technology had created capabilities that transcended traditional concepts of naval strength. The Americans had succeeded not simply because they built better ships or trained better pilots, but because they had created a system of warfare that could adapt, learn, and improve continuously under the pressure of combat. The Essex-class carriers were impressive individual vessels, but their true power came from their integration into a larger system that included submarines, amphibious forces, advanced bases, and the industrial capacity to sustain them all indefinitely. The Japanese, despite their individual courage and tactical skill, had never developed an equivalent system. Their strategy remained focused on the decisive battle, the single overwhelming blow that would determine the outcome of the campaign. When American forces demonstrated the ability to absorb such blows and continue fighting, Japanese strategy had no answer. This failure was not simply a matter of resources or technology. Though both were important factors, it reflected a fundamental difference in strategic thinking between the two nations. American military planners, influenced by their experience in previous wars and their understanding of industrial warfare, had designed their forces for sustained operations under adverse conditions. Japanese planners, influenced by their experience in previous conflicts against technologically inferior opponents, had optimized their forces for short, decisive campaigns against enemies who could not replace their losses. The Central Pacific campaign demonstrated which approach was better suited to the realities of modern warfare. The Essex-class carriers and the operational doctrine built around them had created a form of naval power that was both overwhelming in its immediate impact and sustainable over time. This combination of capability and endurance would prove decisive not only in the Pacific War, but in the broader strategic competition that would follow. The legacy of the Central Pacific campaign extended far beyond the immediate military consequences of American victory. The demonstration that air power could be projected globally from mobile platforms had implications for the post-war international order that would become apparent during the Cold War. The techniques of amphibious warfare pioneered during the island hopping campaign would influence military operations from Korea to the Persian Gulf. Most importantly, the integration of technology, logistics, and human organization that had characterized American success in the Pacific would become a model for military innovation throughout the modern era. As the Pacific War drew to its close in the summer of 1945, the sailors and aviators who had served aboard the Essex-class carriers could take pride in their role in a historic transformation. They had not simply defeated a powerful enemy, they had participated in the creation of a new form of warfare that would influence military affairs for generations to come. The flight decks that never slept had awakened a sleeping giant, and that giant had proven that the future of naval warfare belonged to those who could master the integration of technology, organization, and sustained operational capability. The carriers of Task Force 58 had written their names in the historical record, not through any single dramatic battle, but through the cumulative effect of thousands of routine operations executed with professional competence under the most demanding conditions imaginable. Each launch and recovery, each combat sortie, each successful mission had contributed to a demonstration of naval power that would resonate throughout the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The Essex-class carriers had proved that the ocean was no longer a barrier but a highway, and that those who controlled the highways could project power anywhere in the world. This lesson learned at enormous cost in the Central Pacific between 1943 and 1945 would shape the strategic calculations of every major power for decades to come. The morning of September 2nd, 1945 found the USS Essex anchored in Tokyo Bay, her flight deck cleared for the surrender ceremonies that would formally end the Pacific War. But for the men who had served aboard her and her sister ships during the long campaign across the Central Pacific, the real victory had been achieved not on any single day, but through the accumulation of countless routine operations that had demonstrated American naval aviation's transformation from a defensive force to the most powerful instrument of warfare ever created. They had indeed built something new, something that the world had never seen before. And in building it, they had changed the nature of warfare itself, creating capabilities that would influence military affairs for generations to come. The Essex-class carriers and the doctrine built around them had not simply won a war, they had defined the future of naval power in the modern era.